Hi, everyone. Today, I would like to talk to you about a study I did years ago with students. I've decided I'm going to make a tape about each one of my favorite articles. And this one is the one about identity changes in people with chemical sensitivity. So let's make this big screen. Okay. So we call it disability-induced identity changes in persons with multiple chemical sensitivity. I was not yet including the electrical sensitivity in my work at that point, and this ended up being published in Qualitative Health Research in 2005. I got to work with these 4 great students, and I want to tell you a little about this study. This was part of a larger study. We asked people to just send us written answers about how having chemical sensitivities had affected their sense of identity and self. As a group, we read the responses, we underlined themes, we had hours of discussions, and we came up with categories and themes, and I'd like to talk about each of these. 2 categories were loss and response to loss. And under loss, we have loss of a stable familiar identity, and loss of self-positioning. I will talk about those in a second. And then under response to loss, we have emotional suppression to meet others' expectations, redesigning the planned life, forced growth, interpersonal support, spiritual support, and identity reconsolidation. So the first loss was loss of a stable familiar identity. This included unwanted and intrusive changes in your personality and behavior. People described feeling less independent and more needy, having to have more focus on the self in order to survive, even feeling selfish for having to do that, feeling no sense of accomplishment, and chemicals interfering with their sense of self continually. I loved this quote. I thought this was such a great articulate quote. How does one cope with an illness that is mind-altering, an illness that is frequently influencing and controlling your mind and actions? You get to the point of not knowing what your personality is anymore. You know how you used to be, but since growth and change is a continuing process throughout life, how do you know if it is you or the chemical influence? When I'm happy or sad, I have to double check. Am I happy or sad, or is there a chemical near that is causing me to be happy or sad? Do I have to leave the situation, or can I stay? I am no longer a separate entity. I am what I am with the influence of the chemicals now. I don't like it at all. I do things that I would consider to be out of my usual character. It exaggerates my tendencies. People set different parameters of behavior for themselves, which depend on what situation they're in. Some characteristics of a person's behavior are inappropriate in certain circumstances. With MCS, you sometimes lose the ability to regulate your behavior to the situation you are in. Does that make sense? The mind is the most important part of a person, and MCS keeps messing with that. So the loss of self-positioning related to your interactions with the external environment, work primarily, work and community access. Losing work and profession was huge for people. Because I am unable to work, I feel like an outsider who is not contributing to the welfare of my city, state, country, and world. Sometimes people had to guess how their profession might have been. I am an RN, but had to give up that career in my early 30s because of migraines. The sensory disturbance would start a few hours after on duty, and the vomiting and severe pain a half hour later. Nursing would have been a great career for me. I love people and I am empathetic. And people describe the lack of outlets for their intelligence and creativity. I feel that my intelligence is not being utilized by not working. I still have much to contribute, and this part of me is not being expressed. I would like to work at home, but the computer bothers me for long periods of time. And so more loss of self-positioning. Isolation was a great hindrance to folks regarding meeting people. I really miss having male companionship. The one I cared about very much and who really made every effort to understand what was happening to me died in such and such a year. There won't be anyone else. No way to meet anyone. People felt that others would not understand their needs. I've stayed out of relationships, romantic, because I didn't think anyone would understand my needs. I've not had children because of this illness. These have been hard to deal with. Sometimes I grieve for the many losses I have had. It never seems to end. Respondents described cumulative losses with regard to self-positioning that left them to cope without job, money, family, or items of personal comfort. People described being a liability to others, having no sense of accomplishment, and making no contribution to society. In some, they talked not about who they were, but about who they no longer were. So the responses to the losses. The first is emotional suppression to meet others' needs. People stopped themselves from discussing their illness because they knew it wasn't welcome. I'm always angry and frustrated with myself and others. If I expressed this to people regularly, I'd be totally friendless. I have to stuff most of my feelings in order not to totally alienate others. People have a hard time understanding that fumes can actually make me ill. And why not? It's hard for me to understand at times. I would much rather go with the flow and not have to pay attention to such details. Through it all, I always wear a smile and am cheerful around others, while on the inside, I have a great big ache. The fear of psychiatric labeling inhibited the behavior of some. I had to forgo personal help with emotional PTSD-related problems for about a decade due to the critical political necessity of not seeming like a crazy EI. So redefining the planned life, the unexpected and sudden nature of the onset of MCS required drastic modifications in people's professional aspirations, intellectual pursuits, and the evolution of their personal lives. I was no longer in control of my old world. I had to develop a new world I could control. No longer could I improve the world by working with the young in a school setting. So I have become an activist with my husband, or MCS. What good is work if it doesn't have monetary value? How do I get over my desire to be a proprietor or to at least be employed? If my way of thinking, what society has taught me, is to judge worth on employment and I am unemployable, then what does that make me? I am not a contributing member of society. Occasionally, I have anger towards a person just for the fact that they are employed. Retirement often had to be redesigned, of course, due to an inability to travel and/or medical bills. So forced growth, skills that people were often forced to learn. The setting of boundaries. Having MCS has certainly forced me to acknowledge and defend my personal boundaries. MCS will definitely meet you where you are, and it will differ depending upon what skills you have or don't have. If you're someone who is used to giving, never setting any boundaries for yourself, you will certainly have to learn to do that, or people will walk right over you and take everything you have left. Learning to accept help from others. People became more assertive in asking for help or for accommodations. Learning about environmental issues. It has been ruinous in terms of normal career and income development. It's forced me into expressing political and economic and social status values that I'd have likely left unexplained. Interpersonal support. Interpersonal support could go either way. Some people received and appreciated positive input from others. I have a very loving and understanding husband who allows me to let out my angers and emotions and listens to me and tries to understand what I'm going through. This is my way of dealing with things, and I'm determined I'm going to get better. Others came to see people in a more negative light as a result of ill treatment. I've become more aware of most people being self-centered. I'm a very giving person, always doing for, being there, physically helping friends and relatives. When I became disabled over a 3-year period in a sick building, almost no one was there for me. So interpersonal support sometimes eventuated in moving on. Sometimes people made new friends. Many informants helped or advocated on behalf of others, so they were able to relate to others' hardships. As people explained, I have 21 years experience with MCS, and I believe this is an inspiration to others, and I believe I give them hope. I have found my life work in helping other MCS/EI people, and EI stands for environmental illness. Although the threat of abandonment from significant others looms overhead, I have developed supportive, loving relationships with other EIs all over the country, largely due to my activism. So spiritual support. And of course, this growth is this is the goal. You know, when you have a chronic illness or a disability, the goal is to make room for the illness or disability in your life without letting it completely blow up your life. So you acknowledge it, you accept it, you build a new life with it. Not everyone was able to do that, but some people were, and some also experienced growth by turning to a higher being or discovering their spirituality. I know that God wants me to recognize and grasp, retain my sense of self-worth. He himself has very vividly shown me that. At times I'm okay with it. He has shown me he wants me to walk straight and tall with my head up. The lack of available medical care and isolation pushed some people with severe MCS toward a spiritual orientation. This has made me depend on me and turn my life completely over to God. When I have a bad attack, instead of rushing to the hospital or doctor, I leave it in the Lord's hands. And some participants expressed thankfulness for what they did have and a greater appreciation of the little things in life. Many described taking, quote, nothing for granted. So in identity reconsolidation, some informants described a positive experience that is finding strength through facing adversity and becoming emotionally stronger. Sometimes these pressures were extreme, as described by one participant. Not even the dehumanizing effects of 11 months of homelessness have broken my spirit. Another stated, I may not be able to be as physical as before, but it can't rob my spirit. A number of respondents thought that they had a better understanding of their personal priorities. Some discovered or developed new talents, focusing on their present abilities. One participant stated, I focus on what I can do, not what I can't. I find ways to participate. I talk to animals, even when I can't pet them. So some people went beyond identity reconsolidation to personal transformation. In many cases, they went to this level of personal integration and growth that they believed would not have occurred without the illness. People grew beyond adjustment or coping to a kind of personal transformation. I feel that having MCS/CI has forced me to look deeply into myself and grow tremendously in terms of my sense of identity. In this sense, it has been a fantastic blessing because of the spiritual, emotional, and psychological work I have done in response to my illness. I feel a strong sense of self-worth and achievement about how I have responded to illness. I no longer feel dependent on work or status for my identity. I feel this is the greatest achievement of my life. It's 6 years now since I've been ill and essentially housebound. I've been through different stages of adjustment along the way, and personal issues varied according to what stage I was at. At this point, there are both pros and cons in terms of my illness. I have a much stronger sense of self because of all I've had to deal with. I know more who I am, my strengths and weaknesses. I've had to go deep inside for strength time after time, and though I have felt acute anguish and desperation at times, I am a more complete person as a result of meeting these challenges and going through difficult periods. So many individuals in our study reported pervasive MCS-imposed life limitations that strongly affected social and professional arenas and robbed individuals of their previous definitions of self. Sharma stressed the restricted life, the social isolation, and the discrediting definitions of self as elements that lead to a loss of self in the chronically ill. What we refer to as a loss of self-positioning is congruent with Sharma's discussion of becoming a burden, in that the person can no longer claim identities based on prior external activities, interests, and pursuits. Although people in our study experienced physical suffering and a lack of access to community resources, many of the negative identity things were related to the cultural treatment of persons with poorly understood illnesses, the loss of self-positioning, the hiding true feelings, the lack of interpersonal support, and the lack of a paradigm for chemicals as causes of illness. The stigma and delegitimization experienced by those with MCS is shared with the emerging conditions chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, and permeates much of the interface that persons with these conditions have with their communities. Though Michael Burry speaks of medical help as helping to conceptualize the illness as separate from one, medical help must be appropriate and effective for this to happen. Persons with MCS, chronic fatigue, and fibromyalgia cannot participate in this medical legitimization of their condition. Care rendered is misdirected, often ineffective, and in MCS, even harmful. Those with MCS represent a hidden population of persons without resources who no longer benefit from most of Western social institutions. Their stories are sometimes told by others, and their problems are often attributed to mental or emotional factors. Their own voices challenge the economic status quo in their suggestion that common chemicals are able to sensitize and permanently injure people. It is easier for those in the dominant culture to disbelieve than to address the issue of pervasive toxins in everyday life, in large part because of the enormous financial investment in the chemical materials that are ubiquitous in industrial culture. So social and political action is often a destination for folks as they go through this. Some of the personal statements indicate people with MCS have responded by becoming involved in advocacy, political action. Women with MCS have become support groups that educate and guide others in taking political action on environmental issues that relate to toxins and health. Some have taken a disability rights approach and demanded reasonable accommodation in the workplace, safe housing, and appropriate medical care for those already affected by MCS, because many with MCS report that their health deteriorated following a large chemical exposure. Others work on the larger issue of environmental pollutants in hope of preventing additional cases of MCS. The actions of our industrialized society in the 20th century have endangered the health of many, and perhaps even the reproductive integrity of the human race. As Lax has pointed out, MCS must be understood within the context of industrial capitalism. Kroll, Smith, and Floyd have called MCS an indictment of modernity. Thank you so much for listening.